You're 12 years old, grinding grain outside your family's mud hut in 1570 Ming China, when the imperial carriage arrives. No ceremony, no choice. A eunuch examines your teeth like livestock, tosses your father a pouch of silver, and you're gone. Sold into the forbidden city's inner palace, where hundreds of women compete for one man's attention. But this isn't a love story. It's a psychological horror that lasted 6 centuries. Why did Chinese emperors need thousands of concubines? Why did parents sell their daughters? And what does this reveal about power's darkest truths? To understand this system of human suffering, we have to go back to where it all began. Back to the desperate choices that families made when survival meant sacrifice. In rural Anhui province, the morning brought the same cruel arithmetic that haunted families across Ming China. A father counted 12 copper pieces in his palm while his wife nursed their youngest child. Their storage jar sat empty after 3 failed harvests. The calculation was simple and brutal. Keep their 12-year-old daughter and watch the entire family starve. Sell her to the imperial collectors and buy enough grain to survive winter. This wasn't an isolated choice. Drought had withered crops across the northern provinces. Floods destroyed rice paddies in the south. When famine struck, daughters became the first sacrifice. Parents convinced themselves they were giving their girls a better life. Palace food and silk robes sounded better than death by starvation. But deep down, they knew the truth. They were selling their children into sexual slavery to save themselves. The economics were coldly calculated. A healthy girl between ages 12 and 16 brought 20 to 30 taels of silver. That was enough rice to feed a family for 2 years. Boys stayed home to work the fields and carry the family name. Girls were just mouths to feed until marriage. When survival was at stake, the choice seemed obvious. Feed the useful members of the family. Sell the burden. The imperial system had created a market for human flesh. Every 3 years, the Ministry of Personnel organized recruitment drives across the empire. Local officials received quotas. Shandong province needed to provide 50 girls. Hunan had to deliver 40. These weren't random kidnappings. This was government policy. Eunuchs traveled with silver and selection criteria. Girls had to be between 12 and 16. They needed unblemished skin and straight teeth. The prettier the girl, the higher the price. Officials treated these collection drives like tax gathering. Villages that couldn't meet their quotas faced punishment. Local magistrates who delivered quality girls received promotions. The system turned child trafficking into career advancement. Families were told their daughters would serve the emperor. What greater honor could there be? But everyone knew what service really meant. These girls would never return home. Confucian teachings made the horror seem normal. Daughters were temporary members of the family. They belonged to their fathers until marriage, then to their husbands. The Analects taught that women existed to serve men. Selling a daughter to serve the emperor was the ultimate expression of filial piety. Scholars wrote treatises explaining why this system benefited society. Philosophy became a weapon to justify the unjustifiable. The transaction itself was swift and final. The eunuch examined the girl's teeth and hands. He checked for scars or deformities. If she passed inspection, he counted out the silver. The father made his mark on the contract. The girl was now property of the imperial household. There were no goodbyes, no promises to write. The eunuch's carriage rolled away with its human cargo, while the family counted their coins. Many families created elaborate justifications for their choices. They told themselves their daughters would live better lives in the palace. They invented stories about imperial favor and royal treatment. Some even convinced themselves their girls might become empresses. These fantasies helped parents sleep at night, but the silver was already spent on grain. The reality was simpler and crueler. Most families never heard from their daughters again. The palace was a closed world. No letters came out. No visits were allowed. For the girls themselves, the journey to Beijing marked the end of one life and the beginning of something far worse. The carriage wheels turned toward the forbidden city, carrying children who had no idea what awaited them behind those massive red gates. Behind those gates lay a machine designed to strip away everything human. The massive red doors swung open with a sound like thunder. 12-year-old Mei Lin stepped onto polished stone her bare feet had never touched. Guards in silk robes flanked her sides. Their faces showed nothing. No kindness, no cruelty, just emptiness. In that moment, she stopped being a farmer's daughter from Anhui province. She became property of the imperial household. The first step in breaking a human spirit was removing every trace of former identity. Eunuchs led new arrivals through corridors that stretched forever. Each girl received a number. Mei Lin became Girl 47. Her clothes burned in a courtyard fire. The rough cotton dress her mother had sewn turned to ash. Palace servants dressed her in yellow silk. Yellow marked the lowest rank. It branded her as fresh meat in the imperial machine. Even her name disappeared. The eunuch in charge decided Mei Lin sounded too common. He renamed her Fragrant Jade. When she tried to protest, a bamboo rod struck her shoulders. The message was clear. She would answer to whatever name they gave her. Her old life was dead. This was her rebirth as an object. Palace doctors treated the girls like livestock at market. They checked teeth for decay. They examined hands for calluses that might displease the emperor. They measured height and weight. They looked for scars or birthmarks. The most invasive examinations determined virginity and fertility. Girls were reduced to body parts and breeding potential. Nothing else mattered. The palace hierarchy turned victims against each other. At the bottom were palace maids who served food and cleaned chambers. Above them were concubines of various ranks. Each level had different colored robes and privileges. The only way to move up was to destroy someone above you. This made alliance impossible. Why help another girl when she might take your place? The physical structure broke spirits through isolation. Each girl lived in a tiny room with walls so thin she could hear everything. But talking to neighbors was forbidden. The courtyards were designed so guards could watch every corner. Privacy didn't exist. Even thoughts seemed dangerous when eyes were always watching. The architecture itself was a prison designed to create despair. Training began immediately. Girls learned to walk with tiny steps that made their hips sway. They practiced sitting with perfect posture for hours. They memorized hundreds of rules about addressing different ranks of officials. They learned to speak in whispers and never make eye contact. Every natural human behavior was beaten out of them. They were being molded into perfect sexual objects. The surveillance system made authentic relationships impossible. Eunuchs watched from shadows. Other girls reported conversations for small rewards. Trust became a luxury no one could afford. The palace created a world where everyone was both victim and potential betrayer. Isolation was total and complete. The psychological techniques were brutal in their simplicity. Officials praised girls for following orders while punishing independence. They gave small rewards for betraying friends. They created false hope by telling stories of concubines who became empresses. Hope kept girls compliant. Fear kept them obedient. Over months and years, many girls developed twisted loyalty to their captors. They began to see the emperor as their protector rather than destroyer. They competed desperately for his attention. They turned against other girls with vicious cruelty. This wasn't love. It was survival instinct warped into something unrecognizable. The ultimate purpose became clear. The palace wasn't just about providing women for the emperor. It was about demonstrating absolute power over human life. Every girl who entered those gates became proof that the emperor could reshape reality itself. But the machine needed more than broken spirits to function. It needed constant terror to maintain control. The courtyard fell silent as concubine Lotus was dragged to the wooden post. Her crime was simple. She had smiled at another concubine during the morning meal. The eunuch called it conspiracy. The punishment was 50 lashes with a bamboo rod. Every woman in the palace was forced to watch. Lotus screamed until her voice broke. Blood pooled beneath her feet. She died 3 days later from infection. The message was clear. Any sign of friendship meant death. Fear became the palace's most powerful weapon. The women never knew what might trigger punishment. Speaking too loudly was disrespectful. Speaking too quietly showed guilt. Looking at a eunuch was improper. Looking away was suspicious. The rules changed without warning. What was acceptable one day became a crime the next. This wasn't accidental. Random punishment created constant terror. Terror made resistance impossible. The emperor's favor was the most dangerous lottery in the world. One night he might shower a concubine with gifts and titles. The next morning he might order her execution for wearing the wrong perfume. His moods shifted like storm clouds. A concubine who pleased him on Monday might be forgotten by Tuesday. Or worse, she might remind him of something that angered him. Imperial favor was like holding fire. It could warm you or burn you to ash. Living under such conditions shattered minds. Women who had been healthy and happy became hollow shells. They jumped at shadows. They spoke in whispers even when alone. They developed nervous habits like pulling their hair or scratching their skin until it bled. Sleep became impossible. Every sound might signal approaching death. The constant stress aged women decades and months. The isolation from the outside world created a sick dependency. These women had no family to return to, no friends beyond the palace walls, no money or skills to survive alone. The system that tortured them also became their only source of food and shelter. They were like prisoners who feared freedom more than their cells. The palace was hell, but it was the only hell they knew. The punishments were designed to terrorize through their randomness. A woman might be beaten for dropping a teacup. Another might be executed for the same offense. The eunuchs decided punishments by rolling dice or drawing lots. Some women were locked in boxes too small to stand or lie down. Others were forced to kneel on broken glass for days. The arbitrary nature made it impossible to avoid punishment through good behavior. Hope became the cruelest torture device. Officials told stories of concubines who became empresses. They pointed to the rare woman who gained real power. These stories kept women competing instead of uniting. Every concubine believed she might be the chosen one. She might escape through imperial favor. This false hope prevented rebellion. It made women complicit in their own destruction. The system created learned helplessness on a massive scale. Women stopped trying to change their situation. They accepted abuse as normal. They competed for scraps of attention from their tormentors. They turned against each other instead of fighting their captors. After years of this conditioning, many women accepted it as truth. They became grateful for their cages. They defended the system that destroyed them. But this horror wasn't random cruelty. It served a calculated political purpose that went far beyond sexual gratification. The suffering was the point. It demonstrated that the emperor could reshape human nature itself. Every broken woman proved his absolute power over life and death. The palace had become a laboratory for testing the limits of human endurance. And the results would shape imperial policy for centuries to come. This research would inform the most calculated political strategy in Chinese history. The year was 1402. Emperor Jianwen lay dead in his burning palace. His uncle had seized the throne through bloody civil war. The new emperor faced a terrifying reality. He had no sons, no heirs. The dynasty that had ruled China for decades could end with his death. In his private chambers, surrounded by trusted advisors, he made a decision that would destroy thousands of lives. He would gather the largest harem in Chinese history. Not for pleasure, but for survival. The mathematics of imperial succession were brutal, but simple. Infant mortality killed half of all children before age 5. Diseases swept through the palace regularly. Assassins targeted royal heirs. A smart emperor needed dozens of sons to guarantee that one would survive to adulthood. More women meant more pregnancies. More pregnancies meant more potential heirs. The concubine system wasn't about lust. It was about dynastic insurance written in human flesh. Court officials calculated these numbers like battlefield strategies. The Minister of Personnel presented reports showing how many women were needed to produce reliable heirs. Historical records proved that emperors with fewer than 200 concubines faced succession crises. Those with larger harems maintained stable dynasties. The emperor's advisors weren't recommending entertainment. They were advocating for political survival through systematic breeding programs. The harem served as a weapon of diplomatic control that reached across the empire. Regional governors sent their daughters to the imperial palace. This wasn't gift-giving. It was hostage-taking disguised as honor. When a provincial leader's daughter became an imperial concubine, her father couldn't rebel without endangering his child. The system created a network of human collateral that kept distant territories loyal. Every concubine was a chain, binding her family to the throne. Foreign ambassadors understood the message immediately. They were brought to viewing galleries where they could glimpse the emperor's vast collection of women. The sight was meant to inspire awe and terror. A ruler who commanded thousands of women could command anything. The concubine system became a symbol of imperial power that spoke louder than armies. It demonstrated absolute control over life, death, and human dignity. The eunuchs who managed this system gained enormous power through organized suffering. They controlled access to the emperor. They decided which women lived or died. They managed the finances that purchased new girls from desperate families. These castrated men had no dynasties of their own to build. Their only path to power ran through the misery of others. They expanded the harem system because their influence grew with its size. The ultimate irony was devastating. The system designed to strengthen dynasties often destroyed them instead. Concubines plotted against each other's children. They poisoned rival heirs. They formed factions that split the court into warring camps. Sons born to different mothers became enemies before they could walk. The Ming Dynasty fell, partly because imperial princes were too busy fighting each other to defend against external threats. The machine built to produce heirs had become a factory for producing civil war. But the individual women trapped inside this system faced an even more immediate horror. They had to navigate a world where survival meant destroying anyone who stood in their way. The palace dining halls would soon become battlegrounds, where a single meal could mean the difference between life and death. Every woman understood the rules of this deadly game. Concubine Precious Moon collapsed during the evening meal. Her face turned blue. Foam bubbled from her mouth. Within minutes, she was dead. The other women sat frozen at their tables. They all knew what had happened. Someone had poisoned her tea. The question wasn't whether it was murder. The question was which of them had done it. Precious Moon had been pregnant for 3 months. In the palace hierarchy, that made her a target. The palace system created competition by design. Officials deliberately ranked the women in a complex hierarchy. Each level had different privileges and different colored robes. The only way to move up was to eliminate someone above you. The emperor's advisors knew that competing women wouldn't unite against their captors. They would destroy each other instead. The system turned victims into weapons against other victims. The ranks were clearly defined and brutally enforced. At the bottom were palace maids in gray robes. They served food in clean chambers. Above them were the lowest concubines in yellow silk. These women waited years for a single night with the emperor. Higher ranks wore green, blue, and purple robes. At the top were imperial consorts in gold and red. Each woman knew exactly where she stood. She also knew that staying there meant death by invisibility. Pregnancy changed everything in this deadly game. A woman carrying the emperor's child gained instant protection and status. Her food was tested for poison. Guards watched her chambers. She received better clothing and private rooms. But pregnancy also painted a target on her back. Other women saw her as a threat to their own survival. The growing belly became a countdown to murder. Many pregnant concubines died before giving birth. Male children were the ultimate prize in this competition. A woman who bore the emperor a son gained power and security. Her position became nearly untouchable. But other women would kill to prevent her success. Pregnant concubines hired food tasters. They slept with weapons. They trusted no one. Even giving birth wasn't safe. Newborn princes died mysteriously. Their mothers followed soon after. The methods of destruction were limited only by imagination. Poison was the most common weapon. Ground glass in rice, mercury in tea, snake venom on clothing. Women learned chemistry from palace doctors. They studied which plants killed slowly and which worked quickly. False accusations were equally deadly. A whispered rumor about disloyalty could bring execution. Sabotage destroyed reputations. Torn clothes before imperial visits. Broken mirrors that brought bad luck. The palace rewarded cruelty and punished kindness. Women who helped others were seen as weak. Those who betrayed friends gained recognition. Eunuchs promoted the most ruthless concubines. They gave them better rooms and more privileges. Compassion became a luxury that could cost your life. The system selected for psychopaths. It eliminated anyone with functioning empathy. The transformation required to survive was complete and horrifying. Women who had been gentle daughters became cold killers. They learned to smile while planning murder. They developed skills in manipulation and deception. The palace turned farmers' daughters into predators. The change was necessary for survival. It was also irreversible. The ultimate tragedy was how the system perpetuated itself. The women who survived became the ones who trained new arrivals. They taught fresh victims how to compete. They passed on the skills of betrayal and murder. The palace had turned victims into perpetrators. But this horror didn't emerge from nowhere. It was justified by centuries of careful philosophical teaching that made brutality seem natural and necessary. The scholar's brush moved across silk paper in the emperor's private study. He wrote carefully in classical Chinese characters. "Women are like water," he inscribed. "They take the shape of their container. A daughter belongs to her father. A wife belongs to her husband. A concubine belongs to her master." This wasn't poetry. It was philosophy. The teaching came directly from Confucian texts that had guided Chinese society for over 1,000 years. The scholar was explaining why selling daughters into sexual slavery was not just acceptable but morally correct. Ancient philosophy became a weapon against the vulnerable through careful interpretation. Confucian scholars took teachings about social harmony and twisted them into justifications for systematic oppression. The original texts spoke of benevolent rulers and respectful subjects. Later interpretations focused on absolute obedience and natural hierarchy. Philosophers argued that women were naturally inferior to men. They claimed that female suffering served the greater good. These weren't accidental misreadings. They were deliberate distortions designed to support existing power structures. The concept of filial piety became the perfect tool for justifying child trafficking. Confucian teaching demanded that children honor their parents above all else. This meant obeying every command without question. When parents decided to sell their daughters, resistance became a violation of sacred duty. Girls who tried to escape were branded as unfilial. Their own moral tradition trapped them. The very values that were supposed to protect family bonds became chains that bound children to their destruction. Confucian hierarchy placed women at the absolute bottom of social order. The system ranked all human relationships in strict categories. The emperor stood at the top. Below him came court officials, then scholars, then farmers, then merchants. Women existed below all of these groups. They had no independent status. They were defined entirely by their relationships to men. This philosophical framework made it impossible for women to claim basic human rights. They weren't seen as complete human beings deserving protection. Scholars and officials used philosophy to clean their consciences while participating in horror. They wrote elaborate treatises explaining why the concubine system benefited everyone involved. They argued that women gained security and status through imperial service. They claimed that families received honor along with silver. They insisted that the emperor's needs justified any sacrifice. These weren't honest beliefs. They were sophisticated lies that allowed educated men to profit from human trafficking while feeling virtuous. Education became a tool of oppression rather than liberation. The imperial examination system required all candidates to master Confucian texts. These writings emphasized female inferiority and male dominance. Scholars who wanted government positions had to memorize justifications for women's suffering. The most educated men in the empire became the most effective defenders of systematic abuse. Knowledge didn't free minds. It imprisoned them in elegant rationalizations for cruelty. This intellectual framework spread far beyond China's borders. Korean dynasties adopted similar harem systems with identical philosophical justifications. Japanese court culture embraced Confucian ideas about female inferiority. Vietnamese rulers used Chinese philosophical texts to support their own concubine systems. The same twisted logic appeared in different languages across East Asia. Philosophy became a virus that spread systematic oppression from culture to culture. But China wasn't alone in creating elaborate justifications for human suffering. Across the world, other empires were building similar systems of exploitation. They all shared the same basic pattern. The powerful created philosophical frameworks to justify destroying the powerless. The details changed, but the underlying structure remained the same. In Ottoman palaces, Caucasian girls served sultans under identical conditions. French kings maintained official mistresses while their wives bore heirs. American plantation owners raped enslaved women while their wives looked away. Today, trafficking networks move millions of women across borders for sexual exploitation. The faces change, the languages differ, but the pattern remains identical. This reveals how unchecked power always finds ways to exploit the vulnerable. Every culture that concentrates authority in a single person creates similar horrors. Roman emperors had their slave girls. Medieval lords claimed first night rights with peasant brides. Modern dictators maintain harems disguised as presidential palaces. The concubine system shows what happens when no one can say no to those in charge. Power without limits becomes power without conscience. The pattern is always the same. Societies identify their most vulnerable members and sacrifice them for the comfort of the powerful. Children are easier to control than adults. Women are physically weaker than men. The poor have fewer options than the rich. These groups become targets not by accident but by design. Those who benefit from exploitation create elaborate systems to make it seem natural and necessary. Tradition becomes the perfect weapon to justify continuing harmful practices. Every generation is told that this is how things have always been. Ancient customs are presented as divine commands. Cultural practices are defended as sacred heritage. The concubine system survived for centuries because it was wrapped in the language of honor and duty. Families were told they were serving their daughters' best interests. Officials claimed they were maintaining cosmic order. Economic desperation creates the conditions that make systematic exploitation possible. When people cannot feed their families, they make desperate choices. When societies offer no safety nets, parents sell their children. When alternatives don't exist, victims stay trapped in horrible situations. The concubine system thrived during famines and economic collapse. Modern trafficking networks target the same vulnerable populations. Poverty is not an accident. It's a tool that those in power use to maintain their supply of victims. Ordinary people enable extraordinary cruelty through their complicity. Palace servants prepared the girls for imperial rape. Eunuchs organized the trafficking networks. Scholars wrote philosophical justifications. Neighbors watched families sell their daughters without intervening. Each person played a small role in a massive system of abuse. They told themselves they had no choice. They convinced themselves they were just following orders. But their participation made the horror possible. These systems adapt and survive even when societies change dramatically. The Qing dynasty replaced the Ming but kept the concubine system. The Republic of China officially abolished concubinage, but wealthy men still kept multiple wives. Modern China banned the practice, but sex trafficking continues. The methods evolve, but the exploitation remains. New technologies create new opportunities for abuse. Different economic systems generate different forms of vulnerability. The psychological mechanisms that allow people to rationalize participating in evil are surprisingly simple. They convince themselves that victims are different and somehow deserving of abuse. They focus on small benefits while ignoring massive suffering. They claim they're just following orders or cultural traditions. These mental tricks allow otherwise decent people to participate in systematic cruelty. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize and resist similar systems today. The same warning signs appear in every culture and every generation. When societies create untouchable leaders, when they sacrifice the vulnerable for stability, when they use tradition to justify cruelty, the pattern begins again. But recognizing these patterns forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about what lies beneath the surface of human civilization. The Chinese concubine system reveals the darkest truth about human nature. When power faces no limits, it creates hell on earth. The emperors who built these systems weren't monsters. They were ordinary men who discovered they could reshape human lives without consequence. The officials who maintained the machine weren't evil. They were people who found profit in others' pain. The families who sold their daughters weren't demons. They were desperate humans who chose survival over love. This is what we become when no one can tell us no. When tradition protects cruelty and power answers to no higher authority. What systems exist today that we defend simply because they've always been there?